This is part one of a 9-part series on foundational beliefs and practices of Anglicanism or the Episcopal Church. And we are going to begin this study by looking at the idea of belief. It seems like a good place to start. Anglicans believe we are formed by practice. There's this Latin phrase that you'll hear a lot in the Episcopal Church, lex orandi, lex credendi. Loosely translated, it says the law of what is to be believed. I'm sorry, I got that backwards. The law of what is to be prayed is the law of what is to be believed. A simpler way of saying that is this: praying shapes believing. This is a radical statement. In English history, we know there was a division between Catholic and Protestant. Henry took the English out of the Roman Catholic Church. His son continued his movement away. Then his daughter Mary became queen. She brought the English back into the Roman Catholic Church. And then Mary died, and Elizabeth inherited the throne. And no one knew where Elizabeth stood, whether she would be Protestant or Catholic. And she held out for a long time and just let people guess. And finally, she, according to legend, said, "I will not make a window into men's souls. We will have common prayer, not common belief." And what that meant was the Protestant and the Catholic sat in the pew of the English church together, saying the same prayers, reading the same scripture, and then going out from that place. So practice for Anglicans and Episcopalians became more important than personal belief. Notice that word, personal. Think about this, if this is a challenging idea for you. Christian practice existed before the creeds. Even the Apostles' Creed, which is the earliest creed that we have. Christian practice existed even before the Christian scriptures. That's a challenging statement for people who grew up in evangelical or fundamentalist backgrounds like I did. And so, this is fundamentally different than the approach most of us were taught. So it's a good place to begin. So I want to begin by saying that this approach is organic and this approach is ancient. What do I mean? Let's talk about the ancient idea of formation. And this might be something that's never occurred to you. But in the ancient world, if you were pagan, if you're Greco-Roman pagan, Zoroastrian in Persia, or if you were Jewish, or if you were part of some of the other mystery religions, you all shared this view of how people are changed into the image of the divine. Imagine that shared framework that you could start having a place of conversation. So what was the ancient idea of formation? And if you're interested, you can read all about this in the works of Aristotle. But essentially, we begin with humans as we find ourselves. This is us at birth. This is us just as we are. And then we have formation, or the Greek word for that is theosis. And then we have humans as we can be. Another way of saying that is our end. Another way of saying that is the Greek word telos, which carries with it the idea of completion or being complete. And so how is this different than what most of us know? Well, in this way of thinking about formation, this theosis, this practice of becoming what we should be, has a part that is done by humans and it has a part that is done by the divine. And I'm using that word loosely because If you were Greco-Roman pagan, you would have wanted to become, your idea of your end would have been the magnanimous man. That was something we read about. And so to travel from humans as we find ourselves into your telos, you would follow the ancient virtues. Courage, temperance, prudence, and I always forget that other one. Look it up on Google if you want. But the four ancient virtues. And so Christians who were formerly Greco-Roman pagan did not abandon this basic idea of how we become formed into the image of the divine. Their deity changed, and the things that they did to be changed in the process of theosis changed, but the basic framework didn't change. So if you were an ancient Christian and you had come out of the Roman world, you would have followed the ancient virtues, but you would have added to them eventually the Christian virtues of faith, hope, and love. We called that the theological virtues. If you were Jewish, you would have followed the law, trying to become righteous. And so the basic framework existed in all of the ancient world. And it was organic. Aristotle compared formation, or the process of theosis, to the idea of planting a seed. So you can imagine a human planting a seed in the ground, and they water it. So that's the human part. They weed the ground. That's more of the human part. They make sure it has enough sunlight, so they plant it in the right place. They get leaves out of the way. They might cut down some branches so that this new seed can grow. So there's the human part. But the humans didn't make the dirt. They don't make the water. They didn't make the sun. They can't make that seed grow. So God has a part. If everything is done correctly, this seed becomes a tree or some other kind of plant. And so this is theosis. And we can see this in Christian scripture. 2 Peter 1, 3 through 7 says this: God has bestowed upon us, through his divine power, everything needed for life and godliness, through the knowledge of him who called us by his own glory and virtue. The result is that he has given us through these things his precious and wonderful promises, so that you may run away from the corruption of lust that is in the world, and you may become partakers in the divine nature. And so, because of this, you should strain every nerve to supplement your faith with virtue, your virtue with knowledge, your knowledge with self-control, your self-control with patience, your patience with piety, and your piety with affection, and your affection with love. And so God is doing God's part. Humans are doing their part. And as we do those things, we become partakers in the divine nature, as the author of 2 Peter said. That is theosis. That's the ancient idea of how we're formed in the image of God, or how we're saved. But that'll be for another lesson. So what changed? Well, in the Middle Ages, over time, the idea of merit or stored merit eventually replaced the idea of formation. And it happened gradually. Of course, wasn't intentional, but it seems almost the same, because you're doing your part. You're doing good deeds on earth. And God is hopefully bringing about change in you, but at the end, you reach your end if your stored merit outweighs your bad. And Luther came along, because this could be easily corrupted as it was. Luther came along and replaced the idea of stored merit. And I'm giving you an overview here of about 400 or 500 years of Christian history. So I'm saying it really simplistically. But Luther came along and said, no, it's not about stored merit. It's about grace. And all of these good things that we do, the virtues, faith, hope, and love, courage, patience, silence, reading scripture, fasting, giving alms to the poor, all of those things the ancient Christians did. We don't do them so that we're formed. We do them in thankfulness for grace. It's subtly different, but it's very different. Well, Calvin came along, and really, that takes the human aspect out of it. I made the wrong arrow disappear. Well, then Calvin came along and he said, no, it's not about grace or stored merit. It's about election. God just makes you part of the elect. And so the whole idea of formation is gone at that point. And so in the more modern era, in the churches that I grew up in, it became eventually more about rationalism and logic. You could, through the right systematic theology, or through learning the scripture well enough, or figuring out the plan of salvation, depending on the church you grew up in, depends on the way they phrased it, you could figure it out. You could be smart enough to learn the plan of salvation, do the work, and find God by yourself with your individual faith, using rationalism, being rational, using logic. And so this really changes the way salvation looks. This really changes the way formation looks. It really changes how the Christian faith operates. And so eventually all we were left with, humans as we find ourselves. So our idea of how we were formed over time, or it changed over time. Over time, theosis, or even the idea of formation, was just simply replaced with the idea of salvation. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. I instantly move from light to dark, from death to life. And there is some truth to that, but it's not the whole truth. And so it's a perversion of what was the original idea. So let's keep thinking about it. If you grew up in the evangelical world, you might have called this systematic theology. A lot of us grew up with that. Systematic theology was a response to the European Enlightenment. It was a Christian effort to gain respect in the academy, or hope that these new educated folk in Europe could wrap their minds around the Christian belief. A great early example of this is John Calvin's Institutes of Christian Religion is an early example of a systematic theology. Well, Anglicans do not traditionally practice systematic theology. It's not primarily what we believe or how our faith is shaped. We have some, but it's not the primary. Anglicans tend to believe in ascetic theology. And ascetic theology existed before the word ascetic theology, or the phrase. What is ascetic theology? Well, ascetic simply means practice. And I'm not talking about the guys who walked around beating their selves with whips. They were ascetics. But no, I'm talking about the idea that our practice is what changes us. So an example of our most famous ascetic theologian is somebody like George Herbert, who wrote poems. And he contemplated the life of the practice of faith. And so this is a different approach to belief. So you see, modern ideas of belief that a lot of us grew up with are rooted in individualism. radical individualism. But early Christians were tribal or communal in their approach to life and faith. That's very different than the radical individualism of the United States. And so this is the big point. This liturgy that we have preserved for us in the Book of Common Prayer, the words that we say every Sunday, the idea of having set times of prayer each day and assigned scriptures that follow these seasons of feasts and fasts and celebration. This liturgy, this practice of sitting in silence, of feasting, of fasting, of giving alms to the poor, of following the virtues, all of this existed before the modern era. And they're rooted in ancient ideas of humanity, of what it means to be human. And so, we believe that praying shapes believing. Here's a question to think about. If the primary focus is on practice, does this change the need for personal belief? I think it changes the way we approach it. Every Sunday when we gather together to say the creed, or to worship, we say the creed, the Nicene Creed. And we don't begin with I believe in the translation that we're using in the Book of Common Prayer, which is the old form of it. We say we believe, because this is our community statement of faith. There might be parts of it that I disagree with, but when I'm weak, somebody else next to me can be strong. It's not about the individual as much as it is the community. We said that this idea of belief was rooted in the practice of being human. Well, a modern example of this is the eternal struggle to lose weight, to be in physical fitness, to have physical fitness. Well, if you were, say, taking the approach I grew up with in the evangelical world to being formed into the image of the physically fit, you would say, I need to fill my head with knowledge, because in the idea of salvation, you fill your head with Scripture. The idea is to figure it out in your mind so you can have mental assent, and that leads you to salvation. Well, in this theory of losing weight, the way that would play out is I read all the diet books, I read about all the best exercises, and then that magically makes me fit. I've known for 20 years how to be perfectly in shape. I have to eat right and exercise. I mean, some of the other details need to work themselves out, but that's essentially what it is. But that knowledge that I have in my head hasn't done me a lot of good. In fact, if I had been completely ignorant of how to do it, but I had had a friend or a mentor who led me in a practice and it shaped my habits, I would be maybe, possibly in shape without actually having known anything about it. Humans function that way. Practice comes first. And so, as we begin this morning with belief, we begin in the idea of practice. Praying or practice shapes believing. See you next time.